when you go into podcast guesting and you really do have that intention of what's the big vision, and you're not just going there for quantity, but you're focusing on quality, then it doesn't matter if it takes a year to get on that show. As long as you are consistently following up and creating value for the host, then they will notice you.
Get ready to build, protect, and sell your expertise online with the Online Genius Podcast. You'll laugh. We hope you won't cry. But you'll always be informed and prepared so you can have the success you want. Here's your host, Bobby Klink.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Online Genius Podcast. I'm your host, Bobby Klink, and I'm really excited for today's show because we're going to be talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart. That's podcast guesting. Appearing as a guest on podcasts was one of the first steps I ever took that really got me some visibility as an online entrepreneur. So it's a subject that I love talking about. There are all kinds of benefits to appearing as a guest on podcasts, which I'm sure we're going to be talking about in today's show. But don't worry, you aren't going to have to listen to me talk about it or take my word for it. I have an awesome guest for today's show. Today's guest expert is Nicole Holland. Recognized internationally as the authority on podcast guesting, Nicole is also known as a catalyst who generates creative, out-of-the-box solutions for her clients, colleagues, and friends. Named in the Huffington Post as one of the 50 must-follow women entrepreneurs in 2017, rated new and noteworthy in iTunes, and featured in trending publications such as Forbes, Entrepreneur Magazine, and the Huffington Post, Nicole regularly shares her expertise on podcasts through virtual summits and courses and from stages across North America. Using a high-touch, client-centric service delivery model, Nicole helps leading-edge thought leaders, authors, and entrepreneurs strategically increase their visibility, likability, and credibility in a way that works uniquely well for them. And I also have to tell you, I am part of Nicole's online community, and I can tell you she knows her stuff, and she really provides great value to entrepreneurs, which I certainly appreciate. So with that, welcome to the Online Genius Podcast, Nicole.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here.
Now, Nicole, I'm excited to talk about the subject matter of podcast guesting. But before I do that, I always like to ask my guests a question or two that's not part of their business life. And in preparing for today's interview, you mentioned that you used to be a foster parent. And I think that's awesome. And I'd like to hear what motivated you to do that.
Yeah, well, we're going back a ways. I've just always been somebody who wants to serve and support others. Like, I truly get great joy out of other people feeling valued and other people feeling like there's a possibility for their dreams to come true, because I truly believe there is. I don't believe there's anybody who can't have, do, or be anything they want. You know, they just need the right supports and guidance and mindset. And so it's funny because when you're in something, you don't always recognize like the problems with it, if you will. But I was a kid that did not have a great home life, but it was just normal for me, right? And so I made my way, and I never did anything that was bad. A lot of kids go in the directions of doing bad things when they're neglected or what have you. And I never did that. And I still always just wanted to help people. But I got it, right? I was very independent. I moved out on my own when I was 16 to a new city and had an adult life essentially, and dropped out of high school and what have you. But so I get the kid that is angry, and so I started working with those kids and doing coaching, and also working in coaching with families to help them with the communications, and just really spent much of my life around kids. And when I was in Vancouver, I was working for an agency. We supported the police, and it's called the ministry up here, but it's, I guess, like in the States, Child Development Services or CPS, I think.
Child Protective Services?
Yes, CPS, yeah. So we supported them. So anytime there would be a case involving children or youth in crisis, then our agency would come in and sort of deal with it. And so with that position, I wound up going into a lot of foster homes, and I was just so disappointed to see some of the things I saw. And I thought, I can do better than this. I can give these kids real, like, I can give these kids the hope that they should have. And anyway, so that's really what inspired me, was just in that position of seeing things that I just thought were wrong in the world. I wanted to fix them. And so I did, in my little way.
Well, it's amazing when you talk about that, and what I know about you as a coach and an entrepreneur, it all makes sense, because I definitely get that that's how you approach what you do in business as well. So I think that's fantastic. But now let's turn to podcast guesting. And look, I'm sold. You don't have to sell me on the concept of appearing as a guest on a podcast, both because I've done that, but also because as a podcast host, I obviously like to have guests. But give me the pitch. Why should an aspiring thought leader want to appear as a guest on podcasts?
Oh, okay. So should. Okay. So it depends. I think for me, I think podcast guesting is like the best strategy ever, because it allows me to be me. It allows me to tell things like I just did that I don't normally talk about, so that people who are listening get to know me in a different way. I'm not just the person who, is the authority on podcast guesting, if you will, but I'm actually a real dynamic human being. And I think that's really important in this day and age, that people are bombarded with messaging and information. And it's like, just stop talking at me. And so podcast guesting allows you to get in front of an audience that you can talk with, that they get to understand who you are as a person, not just what you do as your career. And it's not for everybody. It's not for everybody. You have to actually enjoy it. I think it's really important to really care about connecting with people and really care about having conversations and being vulnerable and transparent and going places that most people won't, because that's what engages people. That's what inspires people. And I think it's really important in podcast guesting, because like a lot of people, they treat it like it's just any other media interview, and they treat it like it's just like a stage presentation. And I think that that's not the way to do it. Podcast guesting is a true conversation, not just between the guest and the host, but between them and the entire audience that the host has built trust with. And yeah, it's just a really intimate medium.
I think that's a great way of explaining it. And I think also, and you can correct me if you disagree, but I think one of the valuable pieces of it is we've all heard the old adage that people buy or do business with people that they know, like, and trust. And actually getting to hear someone's voice and hear them in a real conversation really accelerates that process much faster than reading every blog post they've ever written ever could.
Oh, absolutely. And I love that you just recently had somebody on the show talking about podcasting, because podcasting as a platform and a way to build your audience and get to know them, it's super powerful, but it's a lot of work, right? I mean, you're still fairly new in podcasting, and I mean, correct me if you disagree, but it is a lot of work. And it's like, just like having a new business, you have to find that audience, you have to nurture that audience, you have to create content, you have to advertise, all this stuff. Whereas as a podcast guest, you get to step into somebody else's house, essentially, where they've already invited all the people over for dinner. They're taking care of those people, and you're being introduced as somebody who they trust and they know and they like. And so by virtue of that, the people who are there hanging out, listening, they already, as long as you really are on point with being who you are and connecting with the host and positioning the host well, you really have this immediate connection to people who previously had never even heard of you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I will tell you, having been on both sides, and you also have been on both sides, so you can relate, you are absolutely right. There's a lot more work in creating a podcast than appearing as a guest. Appearing as a guest, again, there's work, and we'll talk about this, and getting ready and in preparing and then finding the shows. But once you do that, you show up for, say, 30 minutes, and that's all you really have to do, or whatever the time amount is, and be ready to have a conversation. So I think that's definitely true and great advice. But I mean, let's go a little bit deeper about some of kind of the tangible benefits that someone could expect from being a guest on podcast. Can people really expect that it's going to raise their kind of visibility and give them social proof? And if so, how do you go about using that?
Oh, okay. So there's a lot to unpack here. It depends on how you approach it. Okay. So yes, it's absolutely always going to be content. So even if you're somebody who's like, I'm not going to put anything into it, I'm just going to show up, I'm just going to talk about my thing and it's all going to be fine, then you know what? That's fine. There's lots of people like that. That's not my kind of person and you'll never be on my show. And that's cool. Like there's a million different personalities out there. But even if that is your position and you don't have any interest in the conversation, just the platform, you now have content that is, first of all, from the host side, as long as they're covering the cost of being hosted by, let's say Libsyn is one of the main ones. So as long as the host is keeping an active account where that content lives online, it is going to be forever available on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Google Play, like wherever the host has given access. So people will always be able to go back to that, even years later, who are going to hear something that you as the guest did, years before, and you can still get engagement from that. Now, the other side of that is something you can do to leverage that content that you've created, that you've only spent that 30 to 60 minutes showing up for and having a conversation for, and the host has actually produced. You can do so many things. You could embed it on your website. You could link back to the host's website. You could do a blog post about it. You could take the top tips that you shared. Like there's so many different things you can do to leverage that content and add value to your own audience while also adding value to the host by supporting their efforts of getting that content out.
I love that you talked about adding value to the host, because I think that's one of the benefits a lot of people don't think about in podcast guesting, which is that as a guest, you end up building relationships with like-minded entrepreneurs. I know, for example, the guest on my very first episode was someone who had appeared on her show, and she introduced me to someone who's now had me on a virtual summit. And so I have found incredible amounts of value. Is that one of the things that you preach to your clients about the benefits of being a guest on podcasts?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a relationship person, right? Like that's what lights me up. If you're familiar with Sally Hogshead fascination assessment, like the catalyst is passion and innovation. And the passion part comes from a true love for building relationships and nurturing those. And so I always tell my clients, like, go into this without an agenda. Don't go in there trying to pitch or peddle or whatever. Like go in there really just being open and present to wherever the host wants to go. And the more open and present and willing you are to hop on the bus with the host rather than drive your own, the more magic can happen, the more connection that can be made. And that person could become somebody who introduces you to others, who introduces you to opportunities, who you become friends with, who you become collaborators with, who promotes your product as an affiliate, who you sponsored. Like there's so many amazing things that can come out of being really authentic and showing up in a way of openness and curiosity about what's possible, rather than going in and saying, okay, so I'm going to go on this podcast and then I'm going to like be done and then I'm going to have the content and move on. I've got a million podcasts that I'm going to be on. When you do that, you're missing out on such an opportunity to be seen as somebody of value to the host. And when the host sees you as somebody of value, they may, do things for you that you couldn't even imagine or expect. And that's really how my business started. This iteration of my business and my agency where I get people booked on other people's podcasts, it started because as a podcaster, I was noticing who was a great guest, who I knew that was a great host. And I would say like, hey, this was a really great interview. Would you like to be on more shows? I'm happy to introduce you to my friends who might be a fit. And so that's what I was doing just because I really liked the person. I wasn't getting anything out of it. There was nothing in it for me other than the satisfaction of just connecting people because I really thought they would enjoy each other. And it was from that I kept getting asked, can I just pay you to do this? And I was like, finally, okay.
It's funny that you are able to bring these concepts to life in such a wonderful way, because as you were giving that answer and talking, what occurred to me was I actually didn't do things right when I started. When I first started to be a guest, I was looking for quantity over quality. I was I went with an agency that tried to book me on all kinds of different shows. And, I would just say yes without even really thinking about it because I was looking for it. And I'll be honest, as I got on more shows, I said, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'd rather have one or two really great interviews with people I really connect with. So I think it's really great guidance you're giving to people that you really should, work to actually do it and find, I think it kind of leads to something. You have to find shows that make sense for you to be on in the first place rather than just going on any show that you can maybe get booked on as a guest.
Absolutely. And I mean, just to toot my own horn a little bit here, because that is what I do. Like, I don't work with everybody. And in fact, right before our interview today, I was on the phone with a client and it's taking longer to get her booked. She's in a totally different niche than I've ever worked with before. And me, just because of who I am, I get very frustrated if I can't over deliver. And so, but she was saying, listen, I don't care if this takes forever. Like, I know that you are really going out there and only getting me on shows. So I'm not wasting my time on shows just to be on a show. Like, I value my time. And so I want to know that when I'm on a show, it's because there's a reason you're putting me there and there's an opportunity there. And I think that's something that I don't know anybody else who does that. And just like with becoming a foster parent, I mean, that's kind of the way I've done everything in life is I see a problem, in my opinion, with something and I seek to fix it. So before I was doing this podcast guesting agency, I was already teaching about it. And it was because as a podcaster, I was getting pitched by agencies and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This really important person wants to be on my show. How wonderful. And then I'd have them on and like, they'd show up from like the airport or something. They wouldn't have a proper mic. They obviously had never heard my show, couldn't care less about my audience. It was just they were in it for themselves. And I was like, this doesn't feel good for me. And the most important thing in my world as a podcast host is my audience. And if I'm not serving them, then I'm not doing my job. And so I was like, I don't want these people on my show. So I started saying no. And I was just teaching people. I had launched a beta program called Interviews That Convert. And so I had some folks come in there and I taught them about all these things that I thought were wrong with the industry and how I thought that they could do it better. And yeah, so that's really how it evolved. But it's so important, I'm going to be on my soapbox here. It really is so important to know why you're doing anything you're doing. And if it's just selfish, like I am a big proponent of selfishness because if you don't take care of yourself first, you can't take care of anybody else. But if it's coming from an ego place of selfishness where it's like, I want to do this because I want this prestige, or I'm doing this because I want to sell XYZ, or I'm doing this because of this is what I want. It's a different place than coming from, here's where I'm going. And this is where I know I'm going. And I'm going to open myself up to all these different ways of getting there and getting there in a very easy way rather than an effortful way. I think when we focus on ease and just doing things in integrity, I mean, like amazing things happen, things you can't even imagine.
Yeah, it's funny how integrity people forget about, but I think you're right. I have found, and your soapbox moment there was perfect because I don't think that's limited to being a guest on podcasts. You need to give. And the more you give as an entrepreneur, I found the better you end up succeeding in life, at least in the long run. So I think that's great advice.
Thank you. And I just want to add something right there and just my own opinion. This is something that I have found with my own community and working with entrepreneurs for quite a while now is that's conceptually people get it. Realistically, I don't think many people do. So I just want to dig into that for a minute if I can.
Sure.
So, because I used to say that all the time, like, you got to give first, give and then get and whatever. But I was coming from a different place than I think most people are. And I think you're coming from that different place as well than most people are. People get stuck in, I'm going to give value because I'm going to create this lead magnet or this whatever, and I'm going to give it away for free so that somebody does this next action. And that's what we're taught, right? That's what we're taught, especially in the online space. But if you shift just a little bit and look at what can I give without expecting anything in return. And I think we talked about this a little bit before we started recording. It's like when you give something, just give it away. And I'm not talking about your time and I'm not talking about like being a doormat. But when you decide there's something of value that I know I have that could help somebody else, like literally change their life. It could be that one little thing that flips the switch for them. And it's information based, and it doesn't take me effort and time and energy to like do it. Then if I give that away without expecting even an opt-in, there's a time and place for everything, and I believe in funnels. But I think when we get stuck in the mentality that I'm going to create content so that I get your email address, you're holding yourself back from abundance, opposed to I'm going to create content because I know this is going to be transformative for somebody, and if they want more, great, they can get on my email list, and I'm happy to provide more opportunities for them to learn and get deeper support if they're the right fit. But I'm not creating content to get their email address. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. I actually had that shift. I think I had it first, actually, personally or relationally, in thinking through these things. And when I was just trying to improve my marriage and understanding that it can't be a transactional thing, you just need to do for the sake of doing. And I had that shift. And it's funny that you talk about it because I'm in a number of Facebook groups that I'm pretty active in. And one of them, not yours, but another one from a very big name online entrepreneur who has courses on list building and webinars and courses and has this great group. There's a question that comes up over and over again about getting stock images and where to get images. I have a guide. It's one of my lead magnets, but the courtesy, you don't do that. You don't post opt-ins in these groups. And so I just asked permission from the admin. I said, look, I'm happy to just give this to people. And they said, yeah. And I said, fine. And I just give it to them because, hey, I just want to help these people. And I think if you have that attitude in the long run, you will be much better off as an entrepreneur, as a person, as everything. And so I definitely take that approach. And I know you do as well, which I think is pretty awesome.
Yeah, and then you're seen as a person of value. We talk about reputation and people want to hold on to it. Also, another call today I had with a client who we were talking about reputation, and somebody was kind of attacking, and they don't even know him, right? But his company and saying some crazy stuff in some Facebook group, and one of his followers or fans or whatever copied it and sent it to him. And it's like, I had to remind him, like, it doesn't matter what people say. Your reputation is none of your business. It's your character that's your business. And as long as you focus on your character, what other people think of you, it'll work itself out as it's supposed to. And so when you do something like that, Bobby, where you do say, hey, can I just give this to this person? Because like I have it and they could benefit from it. That gets you known and recognized as somebody who is of value. And that is something that your reputation, it develops because of what you do and how you do it and who you are, opposed to what you tell people they should think.
Yeah, I think that's all great. I'm going to try to bring us back to podcast guesting. Now, I mean, look, I think this has been a great conversation. And I think in some ways, this may be some of the most valuable interaction that I'm going to have this week. And so I think it's definitely worth doing. But I do want to get back to being a guest on podcast. And so now I want to ask what someone needs to do. What is kind of the prep work they need to do if they decide, hey, I want to go down this route and be a guest on podcasts?
Absolutely. So if it's okay, I'm going to plug my show here and just let people know that Get Guest Ready is my podcast that teaches you literally how to do just that. It's like, then you can go more into depth. But essentially, you have to know your why. And this is kind of what we've been talking about. And even though it wasn't necessarily podcast guesting related, it was, because if you know why you're doing something, your long-term vision, why do you want to get on these shows? What's your mission with that? How is it going to help you? Then it's really easy to figure out which shows to get on. And a lot of people say, I want to be on this show because it's like the biggest in the industry. And, but you got to question yourself, why? What's it going to give you? Like, what do you really want to accomplish? And if it is that you just want to get that, as seen on, great, then go for it. But when you then are looking for shows, look at, is it the right audience? Like the person who has the show, are those people who are listening, people who are also your buyers, the people who you are selling to. And we're talking about selling because we're in business. This is, a business podcast. So it's not just, I see people all the time in these guest Facebook groups where they're like, I'll be on your show. I'll be on your show. I'll be like, you haven't even listened to the show. You don't even know what it is. Like, why do you think it's appropriate for you to be on the show? So don't do that. When you want to be on a podcast, make sure you're really intentional about what podcast do I want to be on. And it doesn't have to be the name of it. It has to be who is listening to that show. And then also, what is the personality of the host? How do they run their show? Some people love really structured, organized shows. As you can probably tell, I'm not one of those people. So for me to go on a show where I have to like prep answers and it's like, it's just brutal and I don't show up well. So you want to make sure that you're finding a host who has a similar style to you, who is going to be able to help you shine in your best light. Those are a couple of the first things. And then, once you know what those shows are, then I recommend the long route. A lot of people I get cold pitches all the time. I literally delete them. Even if they're for people I know who their names are. If I get cold pitches, they're not engaging with me, but they're just saying, I think this person would be great for your show, or I will be great on your show, and here's why. And then they send me this long thing. Like, I don't have time for that. Again, I'm not everybody, but this is how I do it. And the folks that I have spoken with who are hosts that I deal with, and I deal with hundreds of hosts, they prefer a little bit more of a wooing, right? Like, I like to, when I pitch a host, I like to go, hey, are you looking for guests? So I make that connection first before I even pitch them anything, especially if they don't know who I am. And then they'll say either yes or no, and they may give me more information. And then from there, if they say we're always open to to guests, or they might say, no, we're not. So, okay, perfect. So I'm not going to waste their time saying, here's who you should have on your show. If they say they are open to it, I'm like, great. So I think that, our client XYZ would be a great fit because here's why, and here is, and I'd give a link to what I call their guest profile page, which is one of the things that I talk about in the podcast as well, Get Guest Ready. Here's a link to their profile page if you'd like to take a look at them. So it's very short and somebody can see that whole message on their iPhone, or, if they're just skimming through their emails, and they then can choose to click or not, right? So I always try and treat people the way I want to be treated. I don't want people to like throw up all over me and assume that I have any need or interest in them. I prefer people to say hi first, like, hi, how are you? Before, hey, do you want to buy my
And again, so I think that's great advice. And Nicole, one of the things, and I think it was in a book or something that I read when I was first looking into the concept, I remember reading, a lot of people give advice to do things. And again, I think it's the same type of thing, but even before you reach out, people would suggest, for example, you maybe stalk them on social media a little bit. And if it's someone like you who has a Facebook group that people can join, maybe join the Facebook group and contribute and get known so that the person says, oh, hey, I know who you are. Yeah, you're great. And then maybe reach out and start the conversation. Is that what you would suggest to people?
Absolutely. That's how I built my podcast. That's how I built my businesses. That's how I'm here right now. Like, you've been an amazing contributor to my group. And my group is so quiet and small, and I haven't had a lot of energy and time to put into it. But I know there's great people in there. And just the value that you've given has put you on my radar. So when you had a show, I was actually a little bit hurt that you didn't ask me right off the bat to be on your show.
Hey, no, that's not fair. I asked you very early on. No, actually, that's not true. The reason I didn't ask you at the very beginning, Nicole, is because you had your summit coming.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You were definitely, you were on my list, but I said, wait, she's got her summit. I'm not going to bother her right now.
That's so considerate. But yeah, like, you could have asked me anything. In fact, I'm not doing summits right now. Like, I'm tapped out, and I have somebody in my community who is putting on a summit. It's the first one. And to be completely honest, it's probably not going to be anything that's going to win me anything. But because I know him and because he's a part of my community, he said, would you be open to doing this? I said, yes, let's just sign it out. You don't need to even pitch me on this. I'm doing it because I know who he is. He's been in my community for a couple of years now, and I want to support those people who show up. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think, by the way, to the listeners, this is another piece of just general advice that's not limited to podcasting, which is, and again, it's funny, Nicole, it goes back to the discussion we had before, the general one. give value and just do it for the sake of it, and it will end up working out for you in the long run.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I have people who I want to have on my show who I've been, letting them know through social media for a couple of years now, and they know who I am. So I'm not just some random person who says, "Hey, I want you to be on my show." It's when I did finally say, "I'd love to have you on my show," it was in a way that they already saw that I was sharing their content, I was liking their stuff, I was already engaging. And so when I asked, they were aware of me. And then, it's like, okay, well, now's not a good time, but come back. And I say that to people all the time. And nobody comes back. And so I keep going back. And I just sent a message to somebody a few days ago and I said, hey, just circling back, at the top of the year, wanted to see how things were and when we could set up a time for an interview. And he wrote me back and said, I'm not trying to blow you off. I'd love to do this. It's just not a good time right now because of, and he actually told me some personal stuff, but I was like, cool, no worries. I'm not going anywhere. So I put it on my calendar to reach out again in 3 months.
It's funny. I do the same thing on the other side on guests. I've had a couple of guests who I've reached out to who, for one reason or another, said they couldn't right now. And then I pinged them again, and I haven't been at this for very long, but they were surprised that someone actually came back to them. And it's good proof that there is some value in being persistent and just, doing the right thing, and things will tend to work out.
Well, the other thing about that, Bobby, is oftentimes it's just because so many people pitch us, right? Like, I mean, I am very appreciative and humbled that my podcast was named in Entrepreneur recently as one of the top 48 podcasts for entrepreneurs. And I think that that's gotten, it's gotten on a lot of radars. And so literally I'm getting 5 pitches a day right now. And I have no interest or patience for any of that. So people look for what's hot. Who do I want to get on their show? And then they really don't care. It's about them. It's all about them. And so when somebody comes back and says, hey, hey, you didn't respond. I get this all the time. You didn't respond to my message. I asked if I can be a guest on your show. Please tell me yes or no. It's like, well, if you can't take a hint. But, when somebody actually sends me an authentic message and then they circle back when it's a better time for me because they care about being on my show or having me on their show, it's like, oh, that's an easy yes. If it's a timing fit, So it's, whether it's podcast guesting or anything else, whether it's you're the podcaster, it's the same principles of treat others the way you want to be treated. Be considerate when you go into podcast guesting and you really do have that intention of what's the big vision and you're not just going there for quantity, but you're focusing on quality, then it doesn't matter if it takes a year to get on that show. As long as you are consistently following up and creating value for the host, then they will notice you. You can't do it in a desperate way and you can't do it in a needy and I want. You do it in a, that's cool. Like, I love your show. I sincerely, I really want to be a part of your world. These are the people who you get to have dinner with. These are the people who become friends. And even though you may think, oh, well, I just want to be on their show, you got to open your eyes up. You got to open your mind up to say, why do I want to be on that show? And if it is truly a value-based thing, you have no idea where it could lead. I can't tell you that people I pinch myself that I am spending time with these days sometimes where I'm like, how the hell did this happen? It's really wild. And it's because I came from that authentic space of I want to get to know this person sincerely, or I want to be on that show sincerely because I really love what they do.
Yeah, I know authenticity is one of the big things that I think you preach. And I think that's fantastic. But I want to shift a little bit to, I think, probably one of the last areas I want to talk about, which is we've kind of talked about the mechanics part and the back end part. People can go to your show, get guest ready, and find some more information about that. But I want to talk about the mental part for folks. And I think there's a couple of people who might have issues here. Some people might be too nervous. We've all heard about public speaking being something they're concerned about, or being worried that they won't be able to answer the questions. How do you deal with that for someone in preparing to be a guest?
They're not ready.
Okay.
You got to get your own stuff handled. You have to be willing. See, if you have fear around that, it's because you're not ready. So you got to do the inner work first. There is absolutely no value to you to go onto a show if you're not ready, because you're going to hold back. You're not going to be a good guest. You may think, oh, I did a good job, but it comes across, the energy is amazing, right? Like how people resonate or get repelled by messaging. And remember, this is evergreen content, meaning that when you do it, and like I said before, if the host keeps on the hosting plan, you could have that podcast interview live on for years. And if you're going on a show before you're confident and before you're comfortable being visible and being vulnerable, it's going to live on. And so when you go on to those bigger shows, when you pitch yourself, oftentimes hosts what we call vet. They vet you. And so they'll look in iTunes and say, okay, where's a show? And they'll pick a show and then they'll listen to it and go, whoa, no, the audio is terrible, or they are so not vibing with me, or whatever. And you could have a completely different demeanor now. You could be ready, but because you had that early on one. So we all improve. I'm not saying don't go on a show unless you're a pro. No, you have to be a novice before you can be a pro. However, what I am saying is if you have mindset holdups about I don't have value to give, or what if they don't like me, or I don't know if I can actually do this, then you need to do some inner work. And either you can go through a coach, or you can come into our community or whatever, but you need to get right with yourself before you try and take it on the road. It's just like dating, right? It's just like you don't get into a relationship and get married to somebody until you're good with yourself, because it's not going to change. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think that's a great piece of advice. You have to know yourself, but there's a subtler point that I think some people worry, and maybe they don't. Maybe it was just me. I worried about this up front because I was often going on with a very substantive topic about talking about legal issues, and I was always worried. And I say that I was worried, but I'm not that worried because I'm a trial lawyer by nature. But what if they ask me a question that I don't know the answer to?
Yeah.
And so I think people worry about that. How can a guest or potential guest get over that fear? Or do you have any advice on that?
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. That's a great question. And that goes back to being confident in who you are and being willing to be vulnerable and understanding that it's the guest show, and being willing to say, gosh, I don't even know. Wow, I've never been asked that before. I mean, I've done that so many times. And I guess at the beginning I was like, oh my gosh, like I'd be thrown off and I wouldn't be able to stay in the flow because I'd be like, oh my goodness, I'd really get in my head about it. But then after practice, I just was like, I have no idea, to be honest with you. And people appreciate that honesty, right? Because we are not perfect. Nobody's perfect. And that shows that even somebody who's a trial lawyer, you don't know everything in the world, Yeah. So I think that just being willing to be human and be real. And if it is something that you feel very uncomfortable with, you can always check with the host beforehand. I like to ask people, when is this going to air? And, if they do editing or not. Now, if you're on a live radio show, that's a different story. But if you're on a podcast, that if you feel like a question comes up that you can't answer in a good way, I would actually say, can we pause right now for a second? And then, see what the host says and say, I actually don't know. And I feel like that question maybe is a bit depositioning to me. Do you think you could ask it in another way, or could we move on to something else? And I think the host should appreciate and respect you for that, because it's not hard to cut that out in editing. And I think they'll feel like, wow, that was really good.
Yeah, instead of someone just trying to
don't fake it.
Yeah, to bluff through it. And again, so one of my early appearances was actually wasn't a podcast, I think it was a live radio spot, and someone asked me, well, it was asking my thoughts about some case that they had heard about, and I said, I really don't know anything about that, so I just can't help you. And
yeah.
Again, I'm not someone who shies away from that. I'm what's called a high D. So I'm saying, I'll just tell you what I think and be honest about it. But I think that's great advice to folks. But are there some people, I think you mentioned also early on that, and I know this for sure, there are some shows that are completely scripted where literally exactly what questions are going to be asked in advance. And then there are some like this, you had no idea what I was going to ask you. Would it maybe be the case that for some people they should focus at first on the more scripted shows so that they can really prepare in advance?
That's a great question. If that's who you are, if you like that, if you're a lawyer, if you're a accountant, if you're somebody who really does feel best knowing what to expect and being able to prepare, then do not go on shows like this that are unscripted and that are conversational. If stuff like that stresses you out and you feel like you're about to take a test, do not go on shows that are super scripted. You want to go on the conversational ones. So you really have to know your own personality and think about it like this is a conversation. And some people, they love going into meetings. They're very organized and they're great at it, right? And they thrive there and they shine there. Then find a podcast that has that kind of environment for you to participate in. But if you're somebody like me and you would just love to get coffee with somebody and just connect and enjoy a conversation, then find a show like that.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I think that probably is a pretty good place to leave off on the discussion of podcast guesting. But there is one question that I have that's kind of scripted, Nicole, and I'm going to let you go outside the area of podcast guesting on this. I like to think of action steps or kind of what's something that a listener could do in either 5 minutes a day or get done by the end of the week where they could improve their business. And what is your suggestion for folks that they could do kind of either in 5 minutes a day or just get done by the end of this week to make their businesses better?
So to just in general, not necessarily podcast guesting.
It can be podcast guesting. It can be outside of it, whatever you prefer to talk about.
Well, if we want to keep it on the podcast guesting, one of the things that I teach to my DIY students about it is, again, I'm going to refer to Get Guest Ready because I go into great detail there where I have more time to talk about it. But once you know your why, once you know your style and all that, then you go and you find shows that are potential places to pitch yourself. And so if you have 5 minutes, you can zip through, 3 shows, let's say, just to get a sense of, is this a right fit? Do I want to put it on my discover more about list? Or do I want to say no? Because you can put, you can open up iTunes and you can have it on like 1.5 speed. Go to the different shows that you've researched and say, okay, let me listen to a few seconds of this. You just, speed through and you listen to the way the host speaks and the way they interact with the guest. And if it feels like a good vibe, awesome. That's a check mark. And if it doesn't, then that's a cross out, right? Goes off the list. And so you can just do these little quick tasks to where by the end of the week, if you do a little bit every day from Monday to, let's say, Wednesday, then Thursday, you can have that list and you can say, okay, these are the people I'm going to listen more to. You listen more to those on Thursday. And then on Friday, you start retweeting their stuff, for example.
I think that's great advice, but I also think you were shortchanging yourself because although you were giving guidance on how to take steps in podcast guesting, along the way, if you happen to be someone where you would potentially listen to the podcast that you would appear on as well, you might learn something along the way also. So I think that's something where you can learn and also move forward in podcast guesting. So I think that's great advice. Now, Nicole, you've mentioned a couple of different places where people can get a hold of you, but what is the best way for listeners to get in touch with you, to connect with you, or to learn more about what you do?
Yeah, so my main website, which is actually under reconstruction right now, and it probably will be when this goes live, it's interviewsthatconvert.com. And from there, you can contact me. I've got my different ways to contact me because it's just like a page that says, hey, we're under renovations. So, here's how you can reach out to me. But if you go to interviewsthatconvert.com/podcast, then that'll take you straight to Get Guest Ready on Apple Podcasts. And there you can get all the things about my opinion on podcast guesting and how to get yourself set up.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And again, I think you're redoing some of that, but I know some of that content I had listened to and it is really good content. So I highly recommend it to folks. So Nicole, thank you for being on the show. I've appreciated it. I think the listeners have learned a lot. I know I've learned a lot and clarified some things in my mind that I should have clarified a long time ago. So I appreciate you being here.
Oh, I am so honored and appreciate the opportunity, Bobby.
That's all for now. Listeners, stay tuned for my quick legal lesson after the break.
And now for today's legal lesson.
Yeah!
You could probably tell from that interview that I really enjoy Nicole Holland. I think she's a fantastic online entrepreneur. She's actually one of my favorite people. So I hope that came through. And she gave some really great advice. Now, for today's legal lesson, I'm going to focus in on something that quite honestly shouldn't be an issue, but it can be an issue. And that is that when you appear as a guest on someone's show, you may be inclined to just try to answer questions and say whatever you can, and you may forget about certain limits that should prevent you from doing certain things. And what do I mean by that? Well, you might have information that you're not allowed to share with people because, for example, you have a confidentiality agreement in place, and that's the only reason you know it. Or because of the nature of a relationship, you have that, and so you can't share it. Or it might be something else, like you have people who have worked with you in your business, but haven't given you the permission to use their name, image, and likeness, kind of like we talked about in last week's episode about podcasting. So if you don't have that permission, you obviously can't use them, even in a podcast, talking about them being your client and saying you're great, because you have to be careful about that. So the point is, and the lesson I would give you is that when you appear on a podcast, like anything else, you need to be acutely aware about not stepping over the bounds when you're talking about information you receive from someone else or about them being a part of your community. And why is that an issue? Well, it's an issue because you're going to be on the spot. You're going to be asked questions. And so naturally, you're going to be answering. You can't necessarily sit there and think about and analyze and really be as careful as you will be able to be if you are writing something, for example. If you're writing a blog post, it's easy to avoid this, right? Because you're not going to be tempted to use it because you'll have time to think about it and really put some time and effort. Whereas if you're a podcast guest, and if you're not used to it, and if you're not used to kind of being on your feet and thinking on your feet, there may be some temptation to go ahead and really just go ahead and start talking about these things. And in doing that, you may cause some trouble for yourself. So that's the lesson for today. You have to think about those things. And so again, I'm going to go down the list of the things you need to be thinking about. Number one, be careful about disclosing confidential information. Now, ironically, I was actually a guest on a podcast once where the host I came pretty close to the line of disclosing confidential information about a litigation settlement he had had. And you can imagine why a host would do that with me, because I'm a lawyer and so wanted to talk about that issue. And, in listening to his questions, I was almost going to be to the point. Luckily, he didn't cross the line. But I was ready to stop him and say, hey, you just can't tell me that, because that is the kind of thing you can't do. But so it might be something from a lawsuit, but it also might be from a business deal. If you have a business deal with someone and you have a confidentiality agreement, you can't disclose their confidential information. It may be that you can't even disclose the business deal yet because you don't have permission. So you just have to be careful about those kinds of things when it comes to confidential information. Then the other piece to think about is when you're telling stories, when you're talking about what you do, and when you have these great stories, because again, that's what you want to do, is tell stories. Don't just be sitting there, talking about things. Be careful not to use someone else's name, image, or likeness, because they almost certainly have not given you permission to allow you to do that. So that's the lesson for today. Make sure you don't disclose something when you're on the hot seat that you're not allowed to disclose. So make sure you keep that in mind as you go and do this, but I would certainly encourage you to become a guest on podcasts. It is a wonderful opportunity where you can really make some great connections, but also start to build your platform. So that's it. This is Bobby Klink. I'm signing off.
Thanks for listening. And remember to visit mistakes.youronlinegenius.com to get your essential guide to the 4 legal mistakes that can doom your business and how to avoid them. Join us next week for another episode to expand your online genius and your success.